we welcome all of you to the 10th edition of JLF London at the British Library, coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the library. It is our pleasure to present today Lives of the Maestros with Oliver Craske and Nasreen Munni Kabir in conversation with Sanjoy K Roy. It is perhaps as difficult to write about an extraordinary life as it is to live one. Oliver Craske, writer and editor in his book, Indian Sun, The Life and Music of Ravi Shankar, reveals an intimate portrait of Pandit Ravi Shankar, the man, the artist, and the legend of Indian classical music. Television producer and author Nasreen Munni Kabir has written extensively about Indian artists, including biographies like Lata Mangeshkar in her own voice, A.R. Rahman, The Spirit of Music, and Zakir Hussain, A Life in Music. Together with Sanjoy K Roy, Craske and Kabir discuss lives of legendary music maestros and explore the intricacies of writing artist biographies. Oliver Craske is the author of Indian Sun, The Life and Music of Ravi Shankar, named as Book of the Year by The Times, Spectator, TLS, and BBC Music. During a career in publishing, he has edited books on subjects from Einstein to the Beatles, cricket to art collecting. Nasreen Munni Kabir is a London-based filmmaker and author who has written 20 books on Hindi cinema and made over 100 TV programs for Channel 4 TV UK, including Lata in Her Own Voice, 1991, and The Inner and Outer World of Shah Rukh Khan, 2005, Channel 4 Red Chillies. She is the author of Zakir Hussain, A Life in Music, and Lata Mangeshkar in Her Own Voice. Sanjoy K Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts. Okay, over to you then.
Thank you so much and good morning. I hope you all have had a wonderful yesterday, and I hope none of you are too depressed about the cricket news this morning. But just to liven it up, we've got these two amazing writers to talk about the work that they've recently done over the past decade or so. And I'm going to start with Munni. Munni, you've really in many ways sort of inked the voices of the great musicians. We've had Zakir Hussain, you've written a book with Lata Mangeshkar and with A.R. Rahman. I want to start by saying, why did you pick these three amazing musicians as opposed to the rest of the spectrum?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sanjoy, for asking us here. It's always lovely to talk about something that one is passionate about. Actually, I've been a little bit selfish in a way, but I always choose people as subjects for books and even documentaries or TV programs, people whose work you can show, say, 5 films of each one and say these are classics and they will endure in time. If you get someone who is going to be great for about a month or two or a year or two, they will have no historical or archival value. So the main purpose is to create an archive of living voices, and that is why the choice of these particular 3. And obviously, there's so much and endlessly to talk about their talent, but you have to try and find ways to say things beyond that, because everybody knows they're talented, otherwise they wouldn't be who they are. And the main purpose is, can you show 5 films or 5 pieces of work of that person and say, yes, this has lasted 40 years, 30 years, and maybe 200 years.
And do you interpret their voices? How do you sort of set aside your own impression of the musician, of the people you've written about in the telling of the story? Because your style has really been, the conversation is what you record.
I must go back to a review that Madhu Jain did in, I think it was 19-something, I think 90, 87, 90, and in it she said, I made a documentary about Guru Dutt, and she said the best thing about it is that the director is invisible. And I thought that was wonderful. That was a serious compliment, because the conversation, if you stick with the subject and you listen and you don't overpower them, then their voice comes through. And really the conversation format is to maintain and keep that voice I mean, I could have got all the information from them and put them in my words, but I haven't made history. They have.
How do you do that? Do you become best buddies with them? Do you hang out? Do you, smoke the beedies and the weed and drink the glass? I mean, how do you get into their heads and their soul?
I wish that was true, but Rahman sir is very, very religious. And Lata ji, I don't think you could start, smoking anything in front of her, let alone weed. And of course, Zakir Saab wouldn't have minded, but it would have been a bit strange. But anyway, I would say that the friendship actually developed after the work. The work came first, and I was very lucky because, again, Guru Dutt is a player in the Lata ji story because she saw the documentary, and then she said to me, "Ha karo, kaam karo." Yes, go ahead. And it was the work that came first. They liked the books, they liked the films, and then they said yes. So the friendship, frankly, was later.
We're going to come back to the whole legacy question in a second, but I just wanted to hold this up. Oliver Crask's book on, if you're a Bengali like I am, and you think you've been born into a thing of culture, then everybody knows everything about people like Ravi Shankar or Satyajit Ray. But what was absolutely stunning when I picked up Oliver's book was that I found things that I don't think anybody knew about him. And it's really a phenomenal book. Oliver, your association with Ravi Shankar actually started way before. You were his editor, you worked closely with him for about 20 odd years. When did you decide that this is what I now need to do, which is record the life of this extremely complex but gifted person?
Good question. Can everyone hear me fine? Yeah. And thank you for your kind words, Sanjoy. As you say, I first met him, I was very young when I first met him. For some reason, I was given this job when I was just 23 years old of going to work with him on what was actually his last work of memoir, Ragmala. So we produced this, and something clicked between us, and we always had this good connection. And it was always in the back of my mind that nobody had done a biography, but for a long time I kind of resisted this role. I felt that I'd been his amanuensis, or whatever you call it, or his editor come ghostwriter. And I think enough time needed to pass. And funnily enough, by the time he died, I was coming around to this idea that I should do it. He died in 2012, aged 92. And so really, I think that his death prompted it. I'd already decided I would like to do it. And then I think literally about a month, 2 months after he died, I called up Sukanya, who was his second wife, and a little nervously, wanted to ask what she thought about this idea that I'd write a biography. And the great thing is I'd always had a really good connection with her as well as him. And before I'd even got the question out, she'd said to me, "You've got to write something more about him." So in some sense, it was very different in that way, that I knew him well, and there was some kind of obligation and fate almost that I felt that...
should you have been alive, would you have been able to write this kind of book?
It wouldn't have been the same book, no. I mean, early on in the kind of research process, I kept feeling the pain of him not being around because I couldn't go and ask him questions. I would discover a letter or something, or somebody would tell me a story, and the first thing you would want to do would be to get his side of it. But over time, I came to see that people talk to you differently when somebody's died. So the interviewees would come out with new angles.
So did you ask him the names of the 186 ladies who he slept with?
I didn't find out this number until late in the research. He wasn't around, so...
An aunt of Arpita and mine was a person who sort of had an affair with him. So it was very interesting to read this book from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think it was incredible experience to find out so much, and what an incredibly rich life he had. But then to go beyond that and to try and think, why was he this kind of person? It's astonishing, the complexity of his private life. But also I came to understand him, why he was like that. And that, he also had these very long relationships with people. But he just, for a sort of long middle period of his life, about 30 years, they were not exclusive relationships. And this is the sort of I don't know whether you put this down. Well, I have my theories about what this was down to. It's partly down to the nature of stardom and the kind of life he was living. But then I also went back into his childhood to try and work out what had made him like that.
And that's really the most amazing part of the book, is really his childhood. And I'm going to ask, Oliver, will you just set the context of how he was a child star traveling across the world and come to the point where he then goes to Maihar, to Alauddin Khan Sahib, who then he refers to as Baba Alauddin Khan Sahib, which is a name that catches. And the difference in his world before as a kid and the world that he now commits himself to for 6.5 years in Maihar in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, so Ravi Shankar was born in Varanasi in 1920, and he lived the first 10 years of his life there, and there was nothing at that time to suggest that he would have been a star. His father was a sort of high-achieving lawyer, statesman, but he didn't know his father. His father was a completely absentee father until he was 8. He wasn't...
His father leaves them. His father leaves the family.
Yeah. His father also, his father also had another wife. So, I mean, there's all this sort of backdrop. But at the age of 10, Ravi Shankar moves to Paris with his eldest brother, Uday Shankar, who, as some of you may know, was a very famous dancer. And they basically had a family troupe which they set up in Paris. And they became absolute sensations in Paris, throughout all of Europe. They were touring all around Weimar, Germany in 1932. It's an astonishing kind of context of... and then they went to America, and they were absolute sensations there. They had 4 tours of the USA in the 1930s. So Ravi Shankar sort of grew up around this performing arts world and celebrity and being introduced to great artists, discovering Indian arts himself through presenting them to other peoples who didn't know them.
So Ravi Shankar began as a dancer in his brother's troupe, in Uday Shankar's troupe. It's not that he began as a musician.
Exactly. I mean, he was a musician as well in that troupe, and he was learning, but he was, for a long time, people thought he was more likely to be a famous dancer than like his brother, than a musician. But then he had this turnaround in his teenage years, and Alauddin Khan was invited to become the sort of guest musician on the tour, and he came over to Europe for a period of about a year, and he would play these sarod solos in between dance items on the stage in sort of London or Paris. And he was such an austere musician, and personality. It's incredible to think of him in that scenario. But during that period, Ravi Shankar...
And strict.
Very strict, absolutely. Everyone was terrified of him.
He threw things and, hit people with his bow.
But the only person he never hit was Ravi Shankar. There was this very strong connection to him. And that's when Ravi Shankar really sort of started becoming really intensely studying music and feeling this was his destiny. So that when the troupe sort of disbands and goes back to India in 1938, the troupe continues. They all go off to Almora in the Himalaya to where Uday sets up his cultural center, where, among other people, Guru Dutt was a student. It's an incredible place.
Sehgal and Uzrapa.
Yeah, but then Ravi Shankar goes to Maihar, to this small town in Madhya Pradesh, where he lives with and studies from Alauddin Khan for the next 6 years. So it's a completely opposite environment. He'd really been, he'd had girlfriends and he'd become used to a sort of Western life in Europe. But then he goes back to this very austere scenario, marries his guru's daughter, Annapurna Devi, and by the time he emerges from Maihar, he's really an astonishing artist, I think, already by 24.
Nasreen Munni, in your book, he's talking about Ravi Shankar. He begins playing with Ala Rakha. Ala Rakha is the father of Zakir Hussain. And in your telling of Zakir's story, or in Zakir's voice, he talks about his relationship with his father in Bombay, in this one-room tenement, and how that sort of shaped him into the musician that he's today.
Absolutely. I mean, Zakir is completely in awe deeply respectful and feels he owes everything to his father, because the father was a genius musician, so is Zakir too, but to have a father like that and to still manage a career and a name and an international reputation and is quite amazing. The big difference, I think, between Zakir and Allah Saab is that Zakir played with many kinds of musicians, with jazz musicians, classical musicians, fusion bands, all kinds of musicians. I think Allah was a little bit more conservative, but that was also the time.
But isn't it that he also had a sense of tehrav? I don't know how you translate tehrav in English, or a foundation, a formal foundation, a considered foundation.
A considered foundation and a deep understanding. And I think what he really learned from Allah was a sense of rigor, sense of practice, that you don't become a master of anything unless you work at it. And I think that is the key thing that you learn from anyone, and he learned it. And now Zakir himself is teaching many students, and it's very, very interesting. I asked him that in terms of teaching, how does he tell a student who is not very good that he's mediocre? He said it's terribly difficult, but some people's hands are just not the right shape and size. And you have to tell them, you can't lie to them, and you have to tell them. And I think that is also a very big quality of Zakir, that he doesn't kind of sugarcoat things.
You know, Munni, Zakir, he's a persona, he's a personality, he's a star, he's got hair and shakes it around like I do. But how do you get behind that? In your telling of Zakir's story, which is what you've done, you've really gone to the empathetic part of what Zakir represents beyond the hair and the persona, and it comes through his music.
Well, I'm glad you think so when you've read the book. I think it was a question of time, and I was very nervous, and I always tell Oliver, I was very nervous to do this conversation book with Zakir, because I am not a musicologist, and my area is cinema, not music. But I was just curious to learn something new, because not that I know anything about cinema, but I think I have learned enough. So I wanted to learn something about classical music, because I feel that is the truest and the most purest form of music in India and everywhere, really. And so I spoke to Zakir, and there's two friends, you know them, Aisha Sayani and Shumantro. They introduced me to Zakir Saab because they know him very well. He said to me, give me some of your books and I'll read them. And then he read the book with Lata ji, and I think Rahman, I'm not sure, maybe Gulzar Saab. And anyway, then he said, okay, you can go ahead, and I will take a leap of faith. And I'll never forget that. That was the term he used, a leap of faith. And then at the end, it was very difficult, because one thing one must remember with these conversations, they are very, very busy people. So what works in your favor is that the work goes over 2 and 3 years. So you build a kind of relationship and a sense of trust with them. But the downside of that is that you never know when you will get that meeting. So you can't plan anything. It just either happens. One day I was in Bombay and I said, Zakir, we have to have another session. He said, well, I'm going to Pune for a concert. Come with me and we'll talk in the car. So for 2.5 hours, and I was hoping there'd be a traffic jam, but there wasn't. It went very smoothly, 2.5 hours, and we got to the hotel where he is, and he checked in, and I said, goodbye, Zakir, and I got an Uber back. So these things happen too.
Oliver, you begin the book very respectfully. The first part of the book, certainly the research part, is very, very respectful. And at some point, your voice starts coming through, because there is a transition in the book. At what point did you start looking at him not as this deified god of all music, but really as a human being who you need to talk about?
I think I wanted to do that all along. I mean, I admire him so much. I think he's an incredibly important figure for India and for the world. I liked him very well. I liked him a lot as well. But I think you don't do your subjects any justice if you're just going to be hagiographic. And I really wanted to know why he was like that. in so many ways. You know, where does the genius come from, or where do the personality traits come from? As much as you can say. You know, I think I wanted to be a bit of a sort of psychological, a bit of a psychologist, I suppose, really.
And one of the things that comes through is that he was always in the right place at the right time at the right happening.
Yeah, he had extraordinary timing. I mean, I talked about how he was in Europe in the 1930s at a time when, you know, they were basically presenting Indian dance to the world for the first time. And then he pops up again in India. He goes back to India. He starts becoming a star really around the time of independence. He becomes music director at All India Radio in 1949, exactly when radio starts to boom in India for the first time. I mean, there were very few radio sets before that time. And so he helps to shape the perception of Indian classical music on the radio in the 50s. He starts touring abroad in the mid-50s. You know, when jet travel comes along, he can start... you know, the timing is extraordinary, really. And so he ended up being like the sort of first person to present Indian classical music to the world. Partly it's about timing. Obviously, it's about many wonderful qualities and charisma as well. I mean, I think it's the whole package that makes it work. But
and
timing was always there.
How does he get introduced to the Beatles?
This was 1966. He met George Harrison for the first time. Now, George Harrison has already played sitar on Norwegian Wood and in fact recorded Love You Too, which was the second Beatles song that had sitar on it, without ever meeting Ravi Shankar. But George is already pretty obsessed with Ravi Shankar and feels that they've got to meet. He went to 2 concerts by Ravi Shankar at the Festival Hall in London, just sitting in the audience before they met. But eventually it's a North London dinner party organised by a man who ran, called Angadi, who ran the Asian Music Circle at the time. And they were sort of brought together, it was an arrangement just because everyone thought they ought to meet and they wanted to meet each other. Paul McCartney also turned up as well, actually. I think sort of almost unexpected. He came to the dinner as well because George was going, I suppose. And the Beatles often did things together. But it was George, really, that was the connection.
And therefore, then the journey back into India, and of course the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi section.
Yeah, so before the Maharishi section, after the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, what George Harrison did was he went to India to learn from Ravi Shankar for 6 weeks because he wanted to learn sitar seriously, and he'd been invited to go. So that really intensified his relationship with India, which became a lifelong fascination and a lifelong friendship between the two of them.
Munni, Lata Mangeshkar, you walk into her house, it's like walking into a temple, and she is this gigantomous persona that all of us sort of worship at her feet. And how were you able to crack her? Because, she is so incredibly reserved and she's so austere when she's not singing. How did you get through to her?
I'm sure many of you, I don't know if you know or not, but she had an amazing sense of humor. And if she felt comfortable with you and she trusted you, she would be very, very funny. Now, she was an incredibly intelligent woman and very funny. And we used to talk about everything. And I think I had made a documentary for Channel 4 on her. It was a 6-part thing. And I called it Lata in her own voice because she'd been singing for everybody else, but was she able to speak for herself? And I was astounded at her intelligence and her understanding of music and everything. And after a while, there was a sense of trust. She knew I was not going to ask her questions that I wouldn't like to be asked, frankly, certain personal questions and so on. And very frankly, I've always been someone through my work, I'm much more interested in the work. I'm not that interested in if they've had lots of affairs or whatever. That doesn't interest me because it doesn't interest me about anyone.
No, but the gossip interests all of us, certainly me.
Yes, but somebody once read the book on Wahida Rahman and said, the trouble is there's no gossip. We don't know anything about the gossip. And that is true. That's not what you're going to find.
But could I come in?
Sure.
Because I've actually had the pleasure of being interviewed by Nasreen myself, and I find that you're a very good interviewer because you actually often ask very sort of open questions, like an ingenue. So you don't actually have to be an expert on tabla playing or Indian classical music if you can ask good questions that get your subject to open up. And I think there's a real knack to that. It's a very difficult thing to do. I must say, I really admired this myself, having done lots of interviews.
So
I felt that this way to get people to open up, you know.
Munni, having done these 3 books, Zakir, Hussain, A.R. Rahman, Lata Mangeshkar, and Oliver's done Ravi Shankar, what is it, a genius DNA that these people have? Is it an instinct? I mean, Lata Mangeshkar was an instinctive singer and performer, pretty much like Ravi Shankar. They're born, in a sense, with that DNA very strongly that shaped their lives. But we're also talking about when the arts wasn't like this. It wasn't necessarily an acceptable profession, you know, for people in that kind of milieu to be able to do this. Yes, Ravi Shankar, Uday Shankar had already become what he was by that time. But certainly with these 3, what do you think makes them so exceptional?
Sanjoy, if you don't mind, I'd like to just read a little excerpt from the Lataji book because it will explain things very clearly. Just a few things. She's talking about Aega Aane Wala. How many of you know the song here? Quite a few. So it's a very famous song of hers. And then she just explained something, and then I will answer your question. She said, no importance was given to playback singers in those days. Producers would think, let them record, pay them, and they can go. End of story. I don't know if you've seen the 78 record of Aega Aane Wala. Well, the singer's name on the label is Kamani. It was Madhuwala's screen name in Mahal. But Aega Aane Wala became so popular that the radio station received thousands of request letters. People wrote asking, who is this singing? We want to know her name. So HMV was called and asked to name the name of the singer. Finally, it was even announced on the radio, this song is sung by Lata Mangeshkar. And then she smiled. Anyway, there is something that I was thinking about coming here today. What was this thing that I really noticed in all 3? It might sound very banal, but it was not only their intelligence and their obvious talent and their gift, but they have this very sharp sense of grasping something. And it was, everybody grasps things and understands things, but not at that speed. So you take Lataji, she would hear the lyrics, she would hear the tune, and in one go, she got it. You talk to Rahman, you don't tell him, well, the girl meets boy on a boat and that's the song I want. You say to him, it's a rainy day and the mood of monsoon is nostalgic and melancholic. He's got it and he gives you the song. Zakir is exactly like that, but it's interpreted differently. He has an extraordinary psychological reading of the musician he's playing with. So the minute he's playing with him, he has sussed the whole personality, the temperament, and how to accompany him in the right way. And that very few people know how to do. They know how to play their thing, but do they know how to accompany someone to heighten that performance and heighten their own performance? And you see, Zakir Bhai, if you see, he can play with anybody. And he seems like he's sitting there smiling and whatever, but he's reading the personality and the temperament, musical temperament of the performer, so that when they are accompanying each other, they are one. And Lataji is one with her lyrics. If you know the songs like, okay, it's a bit regressive, but Aapki nazaron ne samjha pyar ke khabil mujhe, or Chandni Raatein pyar ki baatein. Gulzar Sahab said, when she says Chandni Raatein, you believe it's a moonlit night. And Rahman is the same. He captures mood. Better than lyrics, I think he captures mood.
But Oliver, you know, when he's talking about accompanying musicians and making it one, in India, especially on radio at that point of time, you know, outside of the sabhas in Bengali zamindar households or in the royal courts where solo musicians could perform, meaning instrumental musicians could perform as a solo, the rest of it was really about accompanying the voice. And it's people like Ravi Shankar who brought to the fore the fact that you could do this in a public space, but as a prime musician on the sitar, not as an accompaniment to a voice. Did you see that sort of play through this whole 4 decades or 5 decades that you recorded?
Well, it's about 9 decades. Yeah, and I think, you're talking about really a sort of pre-independence system of music, and it really did change in that kind of era, and you see that in Ravi Shankar's own career, and he was really sort of championing this new world where classical music was not just played in households or courts and so on, that it should be on the radio, and that there should be big concerts, and the musicians who previously been employed by perhaps at a court and had relatively lowly status, really, and often were low caste. This all changed. He really pushed the idea that musicians should be respected. He demanded respect for the music, for the instrument, for the you do see that in his career. And I think of him as being a sort of first among equals about this whole generation that emerged around independence. Wonderful, wonderful classical musicians. And he was really leading the way, not only musically but also in how the music should be perceived and presented on a stage, on vinyl, on records, in concerts, and on the radio.
Annapurna Devi, the myth that goes around is that Annapurna Devi was this absolute magical performer, and they did this tryst where she said, I will not perform because it's you. I mean, you are the star. Is that true? Is that what you found?
It's mostly myth. I mean, marriage is a very complicated thing to write about, and but I do write about it quite a bit. I mean, obviously they fell apart rather spectacularly as a couple, and people still enjoy talking about it. Musically, I don't think the music was the problem. I think that later on, relatively late in the relationship, she seems to have decided that she wasn't going to perform live and felt that this might rescue the marriage. But he certainly didn't tell her to do that. And I don't think it really ever had any prospect of saving the marriage, if we put it like that. But it's become this very strong story. I think the deeper story is that she, I'm sure, was an incredible musician, but she wasn't really suited to the public stage. And to, her father had sort of had told her, really encouraging her the idea that you play for God, and and so she ended up not giving public recitals, but she was a fantastic teacher, and she had disciples like Hari Prasad Chaurasia. I mean, many really fantastic disciples, and so that's how she left her legacy. And in the end of the day, I sort of feel that's fine. They both played very different roles. They're very different personalities. It's sort of amazing that they were together as long as they were, I feel, really.
And did it change his relationship with his guru, with Baba Alauddin Khan Sahib, when his marriage spectacularly fell apart?
I think it did, yes. Yeah, no doubt. But he was always respectful to his guru, and I think this was also a pain within him that, he couldn't really make good this problem with his guru. But they always retained their relationship. He would visit him, he would pay respect to him, always talking about his guru. He was very into the whole Guru Shishya system himself. He had so many disciples himself.
Alauddin Khan Sahib's son, Ali Akbar Khan, and Pandit Ravi Shankar worked together for at least a decade, really closely. And where one left off, the other began. It was a spectacular relationship.
Yeah, these Jugalbandi duets, it was really quite unusual, I think, at the time that you would have instrumental Jugalbandi duets, and they became quite a phenomenon in the 40s, the 50s. And then in later years, they would still play occasional concerts. There are a couple of wonderful, wonderful albums that you can still hear them playing together on. But they became like a special occasion. I think that all those family
Was there a rivalry there in later years?
I don't know about rivalry. I think it was they became more like two stars in separate orbits. And then I think that sometimes they would come back together and be with tremendous love and feeling, and but they didn't want to hang out all the time together by that point.
I'll come back to Yohidi Menuhin in a second. Munni A.R. Rahman, again, a huge public figure, but totally self-effacing. Nobody ever gets behind, the whole sentiment of what A.R. Rahman and his music represents, because He says, it's my music, that's me. But you got behind that facade.
Well, I think so, but you know, when we started that book, which is some years ago now, Rahman hardly spoke. Sanjoy, it was really hard work. And what he would do is you'd ask him something, he'd give you yes, no answers. And so I used to say, Rahman, this is going to be a difficult book, otherwise give me at least a sentence, you know. So then that went on. But he's got another terrific sense of humor. All three do, actually. They're very funny people. They make you laugh. So I said, Rahman, really, this is going to be a subtitle, not a book. So anyway, then he said, okay. And then he would try. But honestly, Sanjoy, I'd have to take 3 sentences he said and add it to 2 more sentences and cut out my question, yes, what do you mean? Because it was not a flow. Today, Rahman talks non-stop. So actually, I was very lucky in a way that was a very...
So what changed? What changed?
I think confidence. I think he came
Of course, he came out onto stage.
Onto stage, 2 Oscars. And the fact that he was recognized. And today, very frankly, with Zakir, I think he is the 2nd most famous musician Indian in the world. Everybody knows Rahman. Maybe it's Jai Ho or whatever, but they know Rahman. And his confidence, he gives concerts, he sings and so on. And when I first met him, I said to him, there's a song in Bombay, in the Hindi version, Kya Kehna Hai, and it's a beautiful alap in the middle of the song. It's beautiful voice. I said, Rahman, who is this person? I want to meet them because it's just stunning whatever they're singing. He said very quietly, it's me. And it was him singing. And now you hear he sings a lot of songs. He's a very wonderful person, and I have a deep friendship. And very frankly, I've met a lot of stars, so I'm not that star-struck. And they are not always very nice people, but I will say these 3 were really particularly nice. Lata ji was a gem as a human being, and Rahman too. One day, I have to tell you this, is not boasting, but it's a health and safety issue. I was getting terrible backache because I was typing a lot, working at the computer a lot. And I told Rahman, my back's aching. So then what happens, this is in Bombay, next day the doorbell rings and his driver comes along with a chair, a Herman Miller chair. And I said, who sent this? He said, Rahman, sir. And that was it. And I said to Rahman, thank you so much. He said, about what? I said, about the chair. He said, everybody who writes and works at a computer, whatever, needs a chair. And that was the end of the conversation.
Wow. Munni, your books, in many ways, don't have an ending chapter. Oliver's book is finite. He's done the research, it's there. Your books can continue because their stories have continued to evolve. Would you at some point of time go back to your protagonists and say, could we do part 2 or part 3? Because everybody changes. I mean, 20 years ago when you first did the story with Shah Rukh, the film, the part 1 and part 2, is a very different Shah Rukh Khan than 20 years later. How do you see your books sort of continuing to tell a story about that character or characters?
The example I have is the 3 books I did with Javed Saab and 2 books with Gulzar Saab, and 20 years between book 1 and 2 with Javed Saab, and about 10 years between, 17 years between 2 and 3. So there is an interesting process that happens. A is there's more trust. B, you yourself as the interviewer or the person who's writing it has better insight, and therefore can ask better questions. I think if you did the same interview, Shabani may agree or not, but the same interview with the same person over time, you will find that you yourself are layering better. You have a better understanding. And I would have loved to do another book with Lata ji. Why? Because after she passed, I realized she has an overview of the film industry that nobody except for another music director, or not even director, but playback singer would have. Why? Because she went everywhere. She met all the directors, all the actresses, all the musicians. Whereas if you talked to Mehboob Khan or Guru Dutt, it would be his story. Well, Lata ji knew them all the best ones. And she had fantastic stories to tell. Plus, I have to say, she was a terrific mimic, and she used to mimic Wahida Rahman and how Sharmila Tagore spoke and everything. It was amazing how she would, she was really very, very, very funny. And that insight she had into the industry, an intelligent insight, and from a woman's point of view, made a big difference. Otherwise, it's always the guy saying, I. Lata ji never said that. She used to always say, hum log, we. She always said we.
Oliver, what did you leave out of the book?
Nothing comes to mind. Well, actually, when I first worked with Ravi Shankar on his memoirs, I said he would leave some things out. And he occasionally said to me, oh, this is what really happened. This is the full story. This can come out after I die. And he's kind of put me in this very interesting role, because I hadn't asked for this role of being his biographer after he died at that time. This is 1990s. So that's when I talked earlier about the kind of responsibility to try and tell the whole story. I feel I've done it. I don't feel like there's a second volume waiting to come out of me. I mean, I was pretty exhausted after this one.
Did you want to just read a little bit? I know we're going to open it up for questions in a second.
Yeah, perhaps. You asked about DNA earlier.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I talked about his brother, the talent that was in the family. So there's definitely a sort of genetic aspect to this. You look at, his two daughters, Nora Jones and Anushka Shankar, being such incredible talents. But it's not just, obviously, about DNA. You have to put in a lot of hard work. I think there are lots of other characteristics of him that were maybe nurture rather than nature. So let me just read this passage. This is about his, this is at the time of his first solo tour of the West in 1957, 56, 57, when he came back from India, this time with his sitar, and was playing solo concerts. So this is the summer of 1957. At the end of the tour, a week was set aside in early August to record another film score, this time in London for Arne Suxdorf, an Oscar-winning Swedish director. But when that recording was postponed until November, Suxdorf invited Ravi instead for 8 days holiday at his home in central Sweden. Here is perhaps the most telling detail of Ravi's entire trip. Despite feeling as though he was staying in a dreamland, that's a quote from a letter he wrote from there, in a 40-room lakeside mansion on a private estate at the end of a draining 10-month tour, he spent this break practicing the sitar for 7 or 8 hours each day. There could be no resting on laurels if he hoped ever to attain true mastery of the instrument. As he had told Time magazine, it is like driving through a mist. The more you drive, the more you realize the road is still there.
Beautiful. I'm going to ask you a cheeky question. We talked about DNA and legacy. Nora Jones or Anushka Shankar, which of them
You can't ask me to choose.
I have to ask you who carries the legacy?
Well, I suppose the obvious answer is Anushka much more, because she's an Indian classical musician.
I'm not asking for the obvious answer.
She would be carrying it more so. But I think they're both important in keeping his name up there. They both talk about him in interviews. They both, had a good relationship with him in later years. So
and Munni, why one sister and not the other? Why Lata and not Asha?
No, that's another impossible question. But I think because Lata ji's songs were my favorites. Not that I don't like, who would not like Abhina Jao Cholkar? Who would not like Asha ji? But there was something that Lata ji did was quite unique, and that was her total understanding, not just of the tune and the convey, but it was the idea that she could emote in this invisible way, being playback singer. I have to tell you, when we released our book, in Bombay, it's a very funny thing happened. There was somebody, many of the interviews that I had with Lataji was over the phone. I'm in Maida Vale and she's in Pedder Road. And then we used to have these conversations. And one time she even sang a little song because she wanted me to write down the words. You can imagine, Sanjoy, I was just like, I could almost faint. But there was somebody in the audience who said to me, Nasreen, you were there and she was in India and you didn't see her face. How did you know her emotion? Before I could answer it, Sanjoy, she pulled the mic from my hand and she said, "Main to playback singer hu." She said, "I'm a playback singer." Obviously. So that kind of invisible talent drew me to her. I thought, wow, this person is not seen, and listen to her, how she's dominated our cultural life. Sanjoy, you can talk about 25 Lataji songs. And everybody in this room who know her work, and that is an invisible contribution, and that invisibility I kind of like.
Let's get questions from the house. Right here. We'll take them in bundles. So one, anybody else? And one there.
Firstly, thank you so much for a beautiful session, I share, everybody's love of Lataji particularly, and also thank you both for your books, which I love, and I teach them to my students at King's College London, and they're supposed to read them. I don't know if they do, but they're on the syllabus. So my question is this: I just finished writing a book which tells the stories of 9 largely forgotten musicians from late Mughal India. And it's a question that I've asked myself, and I was wondering if you both had an answer to the question, what is it about the lives of musicians, stories about musicians, which are so important in Hindustani musical culture? What do they say about music and its meaning to people today, do you think? You want to start?
We'll take another question.
No, let's start with that. And then the gentleman right on the other side. Just hold the question. Let them answer this one and then we'll.
Shall I go? Good question. I think in general, I think that people often are interested in musicians' lives as a way of perhaps trying to understand the music. Many of us are not perhaps technically trained, they might not be able to understand the music in the same way, but it moves them very much. And so biography ends up being quite an interesting way of perhaps trying to understand the music that is created by that person. It's a very general answer and not specifically relating to Hindustani musicians, but I think there's some truth in that.
I think it's a very difficult question. But I think that, very frankly, even writing a book on music is very difficult. Because, as we know, music is experienced. And to that experience is our own emotions. We attach those. And I am not always sure that people want to know that that person has a whole life and a whole story, which is separate from my projection of emotion on them. I'm not so sure, because we all know that there are, I don't know how many books on the Beatles, but listening to Can't Buy Me Love or any of their songs is a totally different thing. And I think that's why it's very tough. You can't blame people for not wanting to hear and learn about musicians. I think today's world is a real problem for writing in general about biographies, because they want to know on Facebook and Instagram what this musician has done yesterday. So what shelf life have these books got? I don't know.
It's on. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for a fantastic session. I have a question for Oliver. Actually, 2 questions. Both about Ravi Shankar's global position and his role in promoting and giving respect to Indian classical music internationally. I'm thinking beyond the Beatles, which you already referred to in your presentation. So, how do you place him in that domain? As some people argue, he had a seminal role in promoting Indian classical music internationally. Another question, which is more to do with films. I mean, he was also, you mentioned that briefly in relation to the Swedish case, but he did compose most famously with Satyajit Ray, but also in Bollywood films. I mean, Nasir would know,
yes.
Nasreen Munni would know,
Yes. Anuradha.
and Meera, Gulzar's Meera.
Yeah.
So why is that he didn't do a lot more in the popular genre of filmmaking, whether in Bengali or in Hindi or elsewhere?
Thank you. I think the first question is relatively easy to answer. I think he was by far the most important person in promoting Indian classical music to the world. And also, I would say, very important for Indian culture as a whole, because he was doing it from the mid-50s at a time when really there were very few people doing this. And he even before he met the Beatles, who always come up, he was already the preeminent person. He was playing concerts in places like the Festival Hall here in London. He was being reviewed in the national newspapers. So he was already giving the music that respect that he felt it deserved. So he's the most important person, I feel, in that. He also sort of charted the map for everyone else in a way. This is how you do it. He showed you this is how you can tour internationally, you can present concerts. And so that goes way beyond even Indian music. That the whole kind of what people might call world music scene. I think he was really very important in establishing all that. The second question I've already forgotten. No, it was about the cinema. Yeah, he was a film nut himself. He loved composing for films. And Patha Panchali was the third film he composed for. It was the first one that was really a success. And I mean, they're fantastic scores, all of those, all of the Opera trilogy films. And he did actually quite a lot of film composition, mainly in Calcutta in the next decade, which I was able to trace. So we're talking about a dozen films at least he did the score for in that period. It kind of faded from the mid-60s onwards. I think he was so busy with touring and he was abroad. Meera was the last film he did for Bollywood. And after that he did Richard Attenborough's Gandhi, which was the big Oscar winner. And one more film after that. But it became a sort of decline in the sort of last half or maybe the last third of his career. He wasn't doing film composition. I think he'd have liked to keep doing more. But I think he was always so busy. He ended up selecting, projects that were very important to him, like Meera. He really wanted to do this. He wanted to pay tribute to her music, her poetry.
Anybody else?
Can I just add one little thing to what your question? In terms of global recognition, I have a problem with it because the Indians or the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis throughout the world, globally, have loved Lata Mangeshkar and have accepted her and known her, and she's a bigger star than Ravi Shankar. But the fact is that our communities have been invisible. So global didn't mean the same thing. And that is what I find a little bit problematic, because this person here is teaching it in her class. Of course, these people are global. It was just that the non-white communities were not recognized.
So
maybe at the end we should...
In that way, Ravi Shankar's different, do you mean? That he crossed over much more?
Yeah, it was only a white audience.
Yeah. And I think at the end, perhaps you can spend a little time talking about East meets West as that one iconic thing that broke through and got both kinds of audiences going as opposed to... But let's, Sanjoy, and then...
Yeah, thinking about all the sentiment and empathy that we just spoke about, very fascinating to hear. I was just trying to put myself in the shoes of a maestro and trying to think, if I wanted my life to be written about, would I get a ghostwriter? And I'm thinking the film Ghostwriter, without any other reference. Would I choose a ghostwriter, or would I choose someone more eminent like a Nasreen Munni Kabir or a Oliver Craske to do what exactly you've done?
One more question and we take...
Yeah, one fascinating thing about A. Rahman is he's translated in all languages in India. I don't know if any other musician captures that, all the audiences within India. So I would like to know what makes it special for A. Rahman. Why does he think differently for different languages? So yeah, I would like to hear your views on that.
You want to
Oliver, you want to answer the first question?
Who would they get?
It depends who they are. It depends what they want. I mean, I think that Nasreen has done a number of these books in the conversations format, and I would think that that's an easier gamble, if you like, for the artist in a way that they feel, you know, and I think that's a great service you're therefore providing by getting them to put their story on record. Other people will want to, you know, have their own autobiography, ghost-written autobiography, or even write it themselves. Yeah, well, I hope so. Yes, yeah. I can't really generalize. I mean, it does really depend on the personality. Yeah.
Yes, I think it really depends on the personality. But I think also some people who want a book written shouldn't, because they have a very, very mediocre output.
I was asked yesterday, can I recommend a ghostwriter?
Anyway, I really think I mean, really. And if there is real talent, the writer will come to them. They shouldn't be wanting a writer, frankly. And then your question, which is Rahman is a favorite, so it's difficult to be objective about him, but I believe that he really broke a lot of rules. And his music was very different. The way he produced his music, his understanding of technology is extraordinary. And he broke a lot of rules. Now you take the song, it has a certain kind of refrain, and that keeps the hook line keeps coming back. That isn't how Rahman works. So he broke barriers even of language. And I think his tunes are so powerful that the language does not matter so much. Now if you hear the songs of Puni and Selvan, especially part one, they're fantastic music, fantastic music. The Hindi version is fine because the tune is the same. But the question is, I feel always Rahman, his music is so powerful that the lyrics come second, whereas many of the others from the golden period, they were really much more balanced in that way. So you had a Sahir and a Shailendra and a Shakil Badayuni with the composers who were equally important. Here, people don't ask who wrote this song when it comes to Rahman. They just say Rahman, A.R.
There's something that I read in your book, your Rahman book, where he actually was saying that he wasn't very good at languages. I don't know if this is true or not. He's being very modest about it, and actually saying that in a way it almost helped him when he was doing his first Hindi film, Rangila.
Because very frankly, as we said earlier, he thinks in concepts, space, air, melancholy.
Like in the movie Bombay when the first one.
That is beautiful music, beautiful. And that tune, that Bombay...
Transcended both genres.
Yes, and the Bombay theme has been used as background in 4 films. In Fire, a Palestinian film, and there was another Israeli film, and then, Iranian. And then in Maniratnam. So I mean, internationally it caught people because it conveyed an extraordinary mood which is applicable in other films. So his music isn't always tied to narrative. But if you take out the song, and even though one loves it, Chaudhry Ka Chand Ho, you take it out of Chaudhry Ka Chand, the film, it doesn't have the same life. Whereas Rahman's music is also standalone.
Oliver Munni, for both of you, what makes music transcend space, nationality, gender, identity, all of that? And if you can also spend a little time telling us about why East Meets West was such a breakthrough album for the genre of music that was which is the North Indian classical tradition.
I'm afraid they called it West Meets East.
West Meets, yeah, okay.
This was the album that Ravi Shankar recorded with Yehudi Menuhin in 1966. I think it was the first big sort of duet between soloists from different traditions. I may be wrong in this, but I see it this way. And it was a sort of #1 on the classical charts for 6 months. It became a real phenomenon. It was, I suppose it was a Western classical maestro giving his imprimatur to Ravi Shankar. This was another great friendship. But Menuhin actually at that time was sort of busking it really on Indian classical music. He hadn't studied. He just had about 3 days with Ravi Shankar in a hotel room where he basically gave him compositions to play that would sound a bit like he was improvising. Well, no, they were fixed compositions, really. They were playing off each other. But it was a phenomenon. I mean, I think it's really important, as you say, that at the same time the Beatles are, and you know, the Rolling Stones and all these other pop artists are presenting, or putting Indian instruments in their songs, you've also got a classical collaboration going on. And that's really important to Ravi Shankar, actually. I think it was more important to him, really, because he always, you know, he hated Indian music being called, you know, a sort of folk or ethnic music or something like that. He was always, it's a classical system, and he kind of...
And what made it transcend boundaries and international boundaries, etc.?
I mean,
was it his style? Was it his personality?
I think it's the whole package, yeah. It's very hard to generalize like that. I think that, you know, he is an absolute top-grade artist, but then he's a wonderful person presenting and speaking to audiences and you know, everything, all the detail, the incense burning on the stage. He knew that he should have a sort of golden light on him, and, you know, he had all that presentation
the
skill.
star factor.
And yeah, and he learned this also, you know, from his brother, really, from being in the dance troupe. His brother was big on that. So it's the whole package, really, with Ravi Shankar. And I think that the thing I got so often when I was reading old accounts was how quickly people got it, that they realized that this was somebody very special. You know, he turns up in New York in 1956, plays a couple of small concerts, and then there's a big photo session in Life magazine, and he's playing at this sort of jazz party where, you know, all the greats were there who'd come to see him, you know. He was the guest of honor. People like, even a young Quincy Jones is there in the audience. So yeah, he definitely had this by that stage, this whole star factor.
I think Indian film music, the problem for it to really have a global audience is language. Because often you find...
But
Rahman is only, basically, Rahman is very interesting because it's one song, Jai Ho, and anybody can figure out Jai Ho. They don't need to speak Hindi or Urdu or anything. So that is why it clicked, because everyone can say Jai Ho.
But he did music for the musical, what was it? Not Star Wars.
Bombay Dreams, but that didn't catch on.
No, not Bombay Dreams, the Star Wars, or... What's the one that opened in Canada and sank without a trace?
I think he did one of the big kind of thing, but those films are just like a big, I don't know, Titanic or something, so I don't know whether it's very musically inclined, but it's the language. And the Indian film song, the languages, especially the older ones, is so important. And so the main connection for the Indian audience is emotional. And how do you get those emotions? Not necessarily by the tune. That's why, in a way, classical music or instrumental music doesn't touch you. It is the words. If you're feeling depressed, you're going to listen to some, you know, some song which has words that will guide your emotions.
But it's still, I mean, in Russia or in Khan Khalili in Egypt, in Cairo, if you walk through the market, they're all singing, you know, Hindi film songs, even if it's Raj Kapoor or Shah Rukh Khan.
But it's Hindi that they think they understand. But it's just miming the words. Like in Senegal, I know quite a few people there who are fans. They just have learned Hindi, or they just, you know, imitate the words, or just by heart the words or something. But it is the emotion is in lyrics. And whether you see the Beatles or the rock pop star, pop music or whatever, it connects with young people or anybody through the words.
Next book?
I'm having a rest. I haven't got a subject yet.
Munni?
Looking for one.
I think I'm having a rest too.
Ladies and gentlemen, while they rest, Nasreen Munni Kabir and Oliver Craske, thank you both so much